In 1347, a fleet of ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors on board were either dead or dying. Their bodies were covered in black boils the size of eggs oozing blood and pus. Their skin had turned black. The stench was unbearable. The port authorities immediately ordered the ships to leave. It was too late. What those ships carried would go on to kill between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia in just 5 years, approximately half the population of Europe. It remains the deadliest pandemic in human history. And the world it left behind was so fundamentally different from the world before that historians consider it one of the most transformative events ever to occur. This is the story of the Black Death. Welcome back to the hidden archive where history hides its secrets. Today we are going to medieval Europe to understand the most devastating catastrophe in human history, how it happened, and the twist that most people never learn about. Subscribe if you're new. A new mystery every week. The Black Death did not begin in Europe. It began somewhere in Central Asia, most likely in the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan or northern China in the early 1340s. Ancient burial records discovered in the 1880s near Lake Sicily in Kyrgyzstan, and confirmed by DNA analysis in 2022, show a dramatic spike in deaths between 1338 and 1339, with inscriptions on gravestones explicitly mentioning pestilence. The disease bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It lives primarily in fleas, which feed on rodents, particularly black rats. When infected fleas bite humans, the bacteria enter the lymphatic system and begin multiplying rapidly. Within days, the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck, swell dramatically into painful black lumps called buboes. This is where the name bubonic plague comes from. Without treatment, bubonic plague kills between 30 and 60% of those infected within days. But the Black Death was not just bubonic plague. It also spread as pneumonic plague, a version that infected the lungs and could be transmitted through the air by coughing. Pneumonic plague kills nearly 100% of those it infects without treatment, and it can spread from person to person without any fleas at all. The combination of these two forms made the Black Death uniquely catastrophic. From Central Asia, the plague followed the Silk Road, the ancient trade network connecting China to Europe. By 1346, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. Here, Mongol forces besieging the Genos trading port of Kaffa catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the city walls, possibly the first recorded use of biological warfare in history. Genos merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the plague by ship across the Mediterranean. It arrived in Sicily in October 1347. By January 1348, it was in Genoa and Venice. By summer 1348, it had reached Paris, London, and most of Western Europe. The speed of its spread was extraordinary. Medieval European cities were catastrophically unprepared. Streets were narrow, sanitation was almost non-existent, and rats, the primary carriers of infected fleas, lived in intimate contact with humans. In some cities, the death rate reached 60, 70, even 80% of the population. Florence, one of the great cities of medieval Europe, lost an estimated 60% of its population in just a few months. The city ran out of coffins. It ran out of graves. Bodies were collected in carts at night and buried in mass graves. Eventually, even the grave diggers began dying faster than they could be replaced. We have extraordinary accounts from medieval writers who lived through the Black Death, and what they describe is almost impossible to comprehend. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian author who survived the plague in Florence, wrote that the disease began with swellings the size of an egg or an apple in the groin or armpit, followed by black spots spreading across the body. From the first signs of illness to death typically took 3 to 5 days. He described a city where the sick were abandoned by their families, where friends and neighbors refused to visit the dying, where the social bonds of civilization simply dissolved under the weight of fear. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. Priests refused to administer last rites. Doctors refused to see patients. The dead lay in the streets because there was no one to carry them away. Boccaccio wrote that more than 100,000 people died in Florence alone in those months. The city, he said, was a city of the dead. Medieval Europeans had no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or germ theory. They had no antibiotics, no vaccines, no public health infrastructure as we would recognize it. Their explanations for the plague ranged from astrological. A conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 was blamed by the Paris medical faculty to supernatural. Many believed God was punishing humanity for its sins. Some people flagellated themselves in public, whipping their own bodies in acts of extreme penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. Groups of flagellants marched from town to town across Europe, gathering crowds and, unknowingly, spreading the plague further. Others sought human scapegoats. Jewish communities across Europe were massacred in the hundreds, accused of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg in 1349, approximately 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive. In Mainz, 12,000. These atrocities occurred even in regions where the plague hadn't yet arrived, driven purely by fear and hatred. The one response that actually worked, though Europeans didn't fully understand why, was quarantine. The city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik in Croatia, in 1377 became the first city in history to implement a formal quarantine. Ships arriving from plague-affected areas were required to anchor offshore for 30 days before anyone could disembark. The period was later extended to 40 days quarantina in Italian, which is where our word quarantine comes from. Between 1347 and 1352, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people. The most commonly cited figure for Europe specifically is that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population died. In some regions, the losses were even more catastrophic. Parts of Italy, France, and England lost over half their populations. Some villages were completely abandoned, their inhabitants all dead and never repopulated. These empty villages still exist today across England and France, visible only as crop marks in fields from aerial photography. Ghost settlements from 700 years ago. But the aftermath of the Black Death was not only death and devastation. The plague fundamentally transformed European society in ways that shaped the modern world. With so many workers dead, labor became scarce. Surviving peasants and laborers could demand higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedom from the feudal lords who had controlled their lives for centuries. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe began to crack. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, driven partly by resentment over attempts to reimpose pre-plague conditions, was a direct consequence of the Black Death. The Church, which had been unable to protect its followers or explain the catastrophe theologically, lost enormous prestige and authority. The questioning spirit that the Black Death unleashed contributed to the Renaissance and eventually the Reformation, the shattering of the medieval Catholic Church's hold on European life. The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe. It ended the Middle Ages. Here is the twist that almost no documentary about the Black Death tells you. The Black Death is not over. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the Black Death, is still alive today. It still circulates in rodent populations across the world, including in the western United States, Central Asia, and parts of Africa. Every year, between 1,000 and 2,000 people worldwide are infected with bubonic plague. In 2017, Madagascar experienced a major outbreak that infected over 2,000 people and killed over 200. The difference between the 14th century and today is not that the disease has gone away. The difference is antibiotics, a simple course of which can cure bubonic plague in days. Without them, we would be exactly as vulnerable as the people of 1347. And here is what truly gives scientists pause. Drug-resistant strains of Yersinia pestis have been identified. Strains that are partially resistant to the antibiotics we use to treat it. The bacterium that killed half of Europe is still out there. It is still evolving, and the only thing standing between us and a repeat of 1347 is a medicine that has existed for less than 100 years. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people in 5 years. It destroyed cities, ended dynasties, shattered the church, and transformed the economic and social order of an entire civilization. And it did all of this because of a bacterium so small it is invisible to the naked eye, carried by fleas on rats, spreading through the narrow streets of medieval cities in an age before anyone understood what a germ was. The Black Death is the most powerful reminder in human history of how fragile civilization really is. And how quickly everything we take for granted can be taken away. What aspect of the Black Death shocked you most? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe to the Hidden Archive, a new mystery, every week, where history hides its secrets. End.